Today, we're going to be talking about one of the hottest and most controversial investing topics right now, that being data centers. With AI mania in full display, we are seeing absolute demand for data centers spike through the roof, and investors are chasing after just outright wonderful returns right now. But this begs the questions of whether or not investors are also going to be facing moral qualms and questions as to the effects of data centers on the flip side. Today, I've taken on the challenge of diving through many different narratives, different media things, different journal articles, even studies to try and figure out just what are the concerns behind data centers and how much validity there is to each individual claim. So I can try and figure out whether or not investing in data centers is just the gold mine that many people portray it to be, or if the risks and the social downside actually outweighs the potential for return. I'll be going over not only major hot topics like right now with the 40,000 acre data center in Utah that's been approved, but I'll also be diving into the concerns about data centers in general, those being some of the environmental ramifications or the water usage or the energy prices spiking, or even just the jobs question of whether or not there are jobs associated, if they're just temporary, if they're being overstated, whatever the case may be. And I'll be trying to give my own opinions and thoughts into whether or not investing in data centers makes sense. So without further ado, let's get into the video. Controversy around data centers is by no means a new thing. We've seen plenty of communities basically in the past couple of years protest against data centers going up in their communities, or different states trying to make appeals to these large companies to bring their data centers into those cities. Whatever the case may be, this has been an ongoing thing of discussion. But really, what's kind of kicked it up a notch recently is the Project Stratos that was recently approved in Utah, or as many people are talking about it, the Kevin O'Leary and team funded data center that is going to wreak havoc on Utah. Now, many of you might have come at this from a political lens because, admittedly, this specific data center has been the discussion of much political turmoil. We've seen videos of protesters screaming at their commissioners who unanimously approved this project. We've seen, as I've mentioned, the Canadian billionaire Kevin O'Leary, famous from Shark Tank, go on to Fox News and say that the protesters were organized by China. Whatever the case may be, it's definitely riled up sides on this instance. And so, with there being so much different narratives pushed in this specific case, I wanted to kind of break it down and look at the actual concrete facts and what's being proposed so that you might have a sense without just getting bombarded with differing opinions and different headlines. So first things first, let's kind of talk about the purpose of this specific data center. While the blanket term AI can definitely come into use for some of its functions, additionally, what hasn't really been discussed as much is the military capabilities with this data center. And that has become a major priority, at least for Utah, in trying to figure out how they can actually bolster their military strength. And this proposed data center is going to help them accomplish those goals. Now, in terms of the economic benefit, what's being kind of sold to the citizens in this area, and additionally what's being sold to the local government in this area, is that it's going to be built in phases. And in its initial phase, they're looking at generating revenues for the county. I'll discuss kind of some of the questions there, but they're looking at generating some revenues of about 30 million annually. And then after the entirety of the project is actually complete, they're looking to make annual revenue of about $100 million. So there's definitely money to be made. Now, where the money's going is going to be one of the talking points later on that really brings into question whether or not the citizens will get ROI as well. There obviously is going to be a lot of money involved if you're pursuing a $100 billion data center. Now, in terms of one of the blanket headlines we're hearing consistently, it's that this, of course, with it being a 40,000 acre data center, which is just absolutely massive compared to any other data center we currently have right now, it's going to be the massive consumption of power. This is going to be a 9 gigawatt facility, which may not necessarily mean anything to you, but it's pretty much double the entire energy usage of the state of Utah as is right now. So, definitely, it's going to be a major implication on the energy component for the state. Now, in terms of the water usage, because this is also a major talking point, they currently have about 10,000 acres and rights currently, and they're looking to purchase an additional 3,000. And this is basically equivalent to 20,000 individual homes water take for a year in Utah. So, of course, the water usage is a big thing. And then, additionally, with it being near the Great Lakes, we are seeing some concerns that already you're seeing migratory species over there are having a hard time as the water is kind of drying up and they're almost in a bit of a drought. But additionally, if the water consumption were to take more water from the Great Lakes, we might actually see worsening air quality due to some of the nutrients and everything being exposed to, well, the open elements. So that's another major concern with the water consumption. Now, something I want to touch on is this is one of the areas where the team has kind of, at least the team behind the data center, has done a pretty lackluster job informing the citizens of how they're actually proposing to not impact things by taking on this major water consumption. They have discussed making the data center a closed loop, which essentially means that the water intake would happen one time and then it would just function off of its water and reclean it and all of that. So it would just be this one time impact, but that doesn't necessarily answer any of the questions that are being proposed of whether or not this intake of massive amounts of water is going to affect the local lakes. Now, closed loop data centers are things that already exist. Obviously, we haven't seen one to this size because this is a massive data center, but definitely in a lot of the smaller ones, you can actually have closed loops where the water intake happens one time and it basically goes in a cycle. I personally recently went to an investment forum hosted by a person whose whole job is picking out the sites and locations to build data centers, and admittedly, it kind of inspired this video idea, but the point being that he definitely has shared that he had significant success with making closed loops and then attaching renewable energy to the actual data centers itself. And we're going to hear some propositions in this Utah piece about how they're going to actually power it and build energy into it so as to not impact the grid. But again, with a data center that size, we're going to discuss how even if they get fully off grid, it's not necessarily going to, let's say, not impact energy for Utah. Also, when we look at the plans in terms of the actual water consumption, so the marketing to the public to kind of ease the concerns has really emphasized this closed loop. But additionally, when we see some of the like papers and plans for this data center, a lot of that water is going to an actual like natural gas energy thing attached to the data center, which doesn't necessarily fix any of the problems because, for example, a lot of researchers have looked into how much if we were to fully power this data center on natural gas, which it doesn't sound like will be the reality. It sounds like they will have some sustainable stuff implemented. But let's just run with the example that if they were going to have the entire data center powered by natural gas, it would actually raise the local temperatures by about 10 to 12 degrees, which is insane. But additionally, it actually makes the dew point significantly less. So any greenery in the area might end up dying because it's too hot to have actual dew or condensation, which again would kill animals in the area that rely on those plants and kill the plants. It's not a good thing. So we hear the public strat of this is going to be a closed loop, even though it's hard to point at a data center that large that has a fully closed loop. You can do smaller ones, but it's a big task to make it closed loop. And then in the actual plans, it doesn't necessarily look like they're closing the loop or making themselves less reliant on natural gas, which was one of the biggest talking points and concerns. Now, one of the big talking points from the data center team is that they're going to be basically off the existing energy grid. And so, therefore, their usage won't actually affect prices at all. But this is an argument that you can kind of poke holes in and doesn't actually help their case because even if we were to say they were completely off the grid, they're still in their plans going to be extracting natural gas from Utah to actually run this. So, in a way, when you have significantly less natural gas available, it's going to raise the price of the existing natural gas for everyone else. It doesn't matter that they aren't necessarily on the same grid. They're pulling from the same supply and they're lessening it, so the cost is going to go up. Like, it's a simple economics class concept here. And I think they're just hoping that the average person won't think that through or find somebody who will explain that. Now, as I mentioned, this topic has become very, very politicized, and that's honestly probably what's reinvigorated this debate around data centers in a way, which, typically when things get politicized, it's primarily negative. But at least for data centers, I feel like it's a good conversation because yes, they feel inevitable, but at least these types of conversations mean we might get compromises to make the impacts less bad. So, on the political discussion, Kevin O'Leary has just been going on social media sites and news sources to claim that all of the protesters were bussed in or that they're connected to China. And he really wants to make sure that the people in the area know that foreign nations and foreign nationals are impacting America's future development, and we're going to lose the AI race to China without building his data center. Which, when you run with the narrative of foreigners plundering American resources, which, fair, like we've definitely heard concerns about that in real estate and other things, it's fair. But you probably don't want the mouthpiece of that message being a foreigner who is trying to come and use the land to benefit themselves. Right. Like, I think a lot of people don't understand that this is like spearheaded publicly. Like, yes, he's not the largest contributor money wise to this project, but he has made himself the face of this project. And he is a foreign national who is coming into Utah, taking a large amount of water, potentially severely lessening the available oil to Utah, and potentially causing environmental harm for the sweet, sweet doubloons that come from, well, being kind to the AI companies and also the defense sector. So, probably the wrong mouthpiece. That's just like a general thing I found kind of weird in these discussions was you don't want somebody who's not the super American to be trying to be like, see, I love America and we're going to fix America, but like you're not an American and you're kind of doing what you're saying other people are doing, where they're coming in, making narratives, and then exploiting the American people. So now that we've talked about the big data center that's sucking up all of the headlines, let's kind of go back and look at data centers as a whole at this point and figure out how we got here with this being a controversial issue and kind of actually kind of dive into the facts not only in this specific instance but in pretty much all of the other instances as well. Now, it's been a big conversation point basically since we got the initial boom in AI a few years ago and we saw this really big bubble and a bunch of talking points that the energy consumption was not going to match what was required for all of this technology. And one of the startling things I found when looking through was that, and there is a big if attached to the statement, I'll say that beforehand, but if the US weren't to severely increase its efficiency with energy production, by the year 2028, data centers would account for basically 12% of all US electricity usage, which is insane. Now, why did I put an if in front of that statement? Well, because typically when we see these types of narratives, humans in a way, in a like really kind of funny way, we see these problems and then we tend to fix them like last minute. So I think for sure when we all say things like this, it's going to actually bring about positive change and we might see energy efficiency actually skyrocket up until 2028 because this is a commonly known narrative, which is kind of a fascinating thing about humans in general. Also, another interesting fact I found is that going off of this 2028 projection on the US energy consumption, in a similar vein, by 2030, we're expecting for data centers to basically use the entire electricity consumption of Japan, which is not necessarily a small country by any means, but just an interesting fact that I found kind of fascinating. And something we aren't necessarily seeing be touched on by the data center companies, and it's really not any of the narratives they're pushing aren't really calming fears because we can see them. Energy prices are actually going up based on the massive intake. I know that's a like no dir assumption. Like if there's something that didn't exist that now exists that's going to be siphoning off a large percentage of energy, of course the prices are going to go up, but it's just something we aren't seeing necessarily talked about that data centers are responsible or contributing. And I have seen multiple things that indicate that it might be less than we'd initially would think that data centers would impact it, but nevertheless, they are positively rising prices. Now, in terms of the water consumption discussion point, data centers in 2023 actually consumed about 17.4 billion gallons of water, which is enough for 160,000 American households for like an entire year. And again, by 2028, that number is supposed to 3x to 5x. So do with that as you will. Water consumption is definitely happening. Yes, some of them are closed loop, and so maybe they're requiring less water on the intake, but a scary part of that is that those numbers don't even show the indirect water consumption that comes from the energy demands themselves, where some of the guesstimated figures are 12 times as high as that. So we're seeing one concrete number being put out, and it's still large, mind you, but it doesn't even show the full picture, which is kind of scary. Now let's talk about a really hot topic in this data center conversation, and that, of course, is jobs. Now, a lot of the industry and even the guy I had the privilege of listening to all kind of cite this one study, this PwC 2025 impact study, where it said that data centers in 2023 supported 4.7 million jobs and contributed 730 billion to GDP, which again, just absolutely insane. But why is this the common talking point and what are some of the problems with it? Well, for one of the major problems is that a lot of these jobs aren't actually permanent jobs. A lot of them are actually temporary jobs that come about with building the data centers. And then by the time we actually look at how many of them are permanently employed to these data centers, it's significantly less. Additionally, one of the resources I actually utilized, which was the Brookings Institute data, where they dove into this complex piece, actually indicated so when we look at job growth, if you were to ask, are there permanent jobs that come about with data centers? The answer would be yes. But the longer answer would be yes, there are, but it's a lot less than you might think. And additionally, it depends on the type of facility that's being built. Now, in terms of the type of facility, they really kind of split it into two. It's simply put, there's the ones that like the tech companies like the Metas or Amazons or Apple's build, and they build out their own data center. And then you have ones that the independent companies that are just kind of looking to build a data center and then sell its capabilities to those tech companies build. And funnily enough, the when the tech companies basically do everything in-house, they actually do create significantly more jobs. And it's not necessarily because the data center itself requires a lot of jobs. In fact, a 250,000 square foot data center only employs about 50 people, and some of the larger ones have run with dozens of people to 100 people. But when you see that these like big data centers are built by the tech companies, what they typically end up doing, which is kind of nice, is they turn it into what they describe as a campus. And basically, instead of just like your one data center and that's it, they'll build a bunch of different buildings around it and they'll house multiple different employment types over there, and everybody will kind of be working in that area. And that's why we see a significant increase, because then you have your like repair people on site and you have your people who have to check in on the lines and everything. And I'm not going to pretend to be a tech wizard, but there are actual jobs involved in that versus just building a data center once and you have a temporary boost in construction jobs. And then once that project's done, there's just a small amount of full time jobs to be had. Now, I did mention that this video idea was kind of inspired by a conversation I got to actually watch at a massive investment forum recently. And it was held by a guy whose full time job is working for not one of the major tech companies, but the other type I described, where a company will come in, build a data center, have minimal employees, and then sell its capabilities to others. And he kind of discussed how his job at this point isn't so much looking at necessarily what we would consider. I mean, there are some things like strong power grids they consider, or proximity to big cities, or whatnot. But one of the biggest impacts of his job at this point is just going to places where people have friendly perceptions about data centers. Now, I've thought about this a decent amount because at the time I was like, oh, that's really good that they go to places that actually want data centers and they build out this thing. But then it kind of dawned on me that, like, if data centers were just truly a good, wonderful thing that everybody would want, that would be like not really a decision point, right? It would be the other stuff like oh, how strong is this power grid? Could we like fit our data center on it without impacting all of the local population? Or is this the right area? Is there a lot of available flat area for this data center, and not where are we not going to get chased out of the area? So I just kind of thought that was an interesting thing, that's become those people's main jobs. And even on like some of the stuff I discussed, we really didn't go into depth on those concerns and how they're being handled. The answer, at least from what I gathered, is that you kind of push that the data centers have the capabilities to be closed loop, and you just don't explain the fact that most of the data centers that do successfully do this closed loop are significantly smaller than the ones that are being proposed. That in their plans, even if you look at their plans, it's, oh, we're going to be using a lot of this water to also get our own natural gas, which will deplete the supply of natural gas to the area. So I just kind of find that a bit interesting. Now, I did mention that some of the data centers at this point are actually using renewable energy. It's obviously easy to get caught up on like the big stories, but there are definitely some data centers that have successfully implemented the closed loop, so the water intake happens once, and then are actually using a considerable amount of renewable energy as well. And they definitely have less of an impact. And if you wanted to try and prioritize investing in a company that, data centers, in a sense, and I'll discuss this a little bit more, but they feel inevitable in a way. But that doesn't mean that the harms to both the world and the population have to be inevitable as well. And we have a proven track record of that with some of these smaller data centers. So there is a history of being able to use renewable energies and not heavily impact the energy costs for the average person. It's just, again, with the smaller data centers. Okay, so we have had a long discussion about the reality of data centers. Where does that leave me in terms of an investment piece? I promised you my opinion, and I'm going to discuss it. So, as I've briefly highlighted, data centers admittedly are kind of inevitable, right? We aren't just going to stop pursuing greed fueled opportunities. People are going to look for ways to get money, and there happens to be a really, really big, notable way right now, and that is with data center construction. And it's going to happen. And it's an unfortunate reality. Now, having the types of conversations publicly where instead of just trying to highlight certain studies that don't show the full picture, or discuss things that we don't actually have like a pathway for, but other smaller instances have been able to do it. I think there are good conversations that can be had about how we can take these concepts and apply them to the bigger data centers we are inevitably going to get. Additionally, I kind of take the perspective of people are going to make money off of this, and I personally would want as many retail and individual investors making money on this as they can, because if somebody's going to be making the money, you shouldn't just let it be the people who come in from different countries, exploit our resources, and then make a bunch of money, who already have all of the wealth. You should at least be compensated in some sort for the environmental impacts and the energy costs you're about to be hit with by other people's doings. And I think if data centers are a thing that you understand all the terrible things that can come of it, and you want to completely avoid, I fully understand that. I would highlight trying to look at it from, this is your chance to be compensated from a thing that is going to happen in the future, that even if you don't want to happen, it's probably going to happen, and this is your chance to make some sort of profit from it, as opposed to getting nothing and then being handed all the negative repercussions. And that is kind of how I'm choosing to do it. And when more people bring up conversations talking about the real situation and the actual impacts, not just saying, hey, this created jobs, and then they actually differentiate, no, it created a lot of temporary jobs and then a very small amount of real jobs. Those types of conversations do make an impact. And those can pretty much only happen if we are at least open to conversating about it, as opposed to just going, this is horrible, let's stop it. Which I fully understand based on when you look at the stuff, it's a lot less exciting than you'd want it to be, for sure, but it's going to happen. And again, as I mentioned, there are plenty of companies that are kind of going about this and doing it the right ways. They understand that they aren't going to give up on the massive money making opportunities that arise with popping up data centers, but they might actually sacrifice the size to get positive public perception. And these types of companies, while it may sound funny, should be rewarded, because if we make sure that we pick winners of data centers that are actually going to be benefiting the people and have a pathway of not just, oh, we know we're going to bring money into the area. It's just we have a clear path of how it's going to benefit the people who create the data centers and the local government, but we struggle to actually highlight how it'll benefit the people who live there, right? If we focus on the companies that do actually answer those questions, that do have a proven track record of doing the closed loop and bringing in renewable energies and not impacting the society as much, we might actually have a chance of positively doing change and being rewarded for it financially, which I personally would consider a win-win in this instance. Thank you so much for checking out my video. I know data centers right now are, honestly, they can at times be a scary conversation because they're often paired with the AI replacement narrative, and they bring in all these different conversations and a bunch of unknowns. But hopefully with this video, you at least kind of understand like the accurate narrative. I've tried my absolute hardest to dive through all of the stuff to test claims. This was one of the longest, at least hours wise, on prep I've done in a video, because there are so many different narratives. Simply put, it's a massive conversation topic and there is tons of money behind it. So there is going to be stuff that is just thrown out there that might even pose as research, and then you can kind of look at it and you can be like, but they're misrepresenting it and they're not telling the full story. So hopefully this was a little bit helpful or entertaining or whatever the case may be, and I really appreciate your time. Thank you.